Abandoned at the altar, the Omega fled as the Alpha who watched from shadows claimed her. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Elena Hart, who stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Mooncrest Hall with her hands folded so tightly that her fingers had gone pale. The silver lanterns above her casting a soft glow across marble floors polished smooth by generations of ceremony. The scent of pine resin and night-blooming flowers drifting through the open arches as the pack gathered in hushed anticipation. For this was the hour when promises were spoken and futures decided. When in Omega stepped forward, trusting the ancient order to see her worth. Elena's gown was simple by design, ivory fabric falling to her ankles, unadorned except for a thin sash at her waist, a quiet acknowledgement of who she was in a world that prized spectacle. And as she faced the altar, she felt the familiar weight of eyes sliding over her, measuring, judging, whispering without words. She had prepared herself for this moment through long nights of doubt and resolve, reminding her racing heart that dignity did not require approval, that she could stand straight even if the world expected her to bend. The elders took their places, staffs tapping softly against stone, the low murmur of the crowd settling into expectant silence as the ceremonial hourglass was turned, its fine grains marking time with merciless precision. Elena lifted her chin, breathing slow and steady, telling herself that courage could be quiet, that strength could live in restraint, and that no matter what happened she would meet it with grace. Yet as seconds stretched into minutes, a subtle unease rippled through the hall, a pause too long, a stillness that felt unfinished, and Elena sensed it before she understood it, the absence where someone should have been, the empty space beside the altar that seemed to widen with every heartbeat. A few murmurs broke free, then stilled again under the elders' watchful gazes, and Elena's pulse thudded in her ears as she searched the shadows beyond the lantern light, half expecting a figure to emerge, to claim the place that tradition had reserved. None did. The hourglass ran thin, the final grain slipping through with a sound like a held breath released, and a tight knot formed in Elena's chest as realization settled, cool and unmistakable. She did not crumble, did not look away, even as the air shifted with unspoken conclusions, because somewhere deep inside her a steadier resolve took root, a sense that this moment, painful though it was, did not define her end, but rather the beginning of something unseen. Unbeknownst to her, beyond the reach of lantern glow and polite attention, a presence lingered where the hall met shadow, watchful and silent, noting the way Elena remained standing when the world hesitated, noting the calm in her eyes when expectation failed, a presence that did not move yet did not miss a single breath she took, as destiny, patient and unannounced, began to turn. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict Elena Hart had ever known, a silence that pressed against her ears and settled into her chest as the elders exchanged brief, restrained glances that said everything without speaking it aloud. When the announcement came, it was delivered with ceremonial calm, words measured and careful, stating that the pairing had failed to manifest, and that the rite was formally concluded, and although no name was spoken, no accusation made, the implication drifted through the hall like cold air slipping beneath a door. Elena remained where she was as the crowd began to stir, the soft shuffle of feet and the rustle of fabric sounding impossibly loud, and she felt eyes returning to her, no longer expectant but curious, assessing the shape of her composure now that hope had been withdrawn. She could have lowered her head, could have retreated at once, but something steadier held her in place, a quiet refusal to shrink beneath a moment that was not of her making. A few whispers slipped free, barely audible yet unmistakable, questions shaped like sympathy or judgment, depending on the speaker, and Elena let them pass through her without response, focusing instead on the feel of the cool stone beneath her shoes and the steady rhythm of her breathing. When she finally turned, it was with deliberate grace, each step carrying her away from the altar and toward the long central aisle, her posture unbroken even as the space around her seemed to widen, people instinctively shifting aside, as if uncertainty itself required distance. She sensed the weight of tradition behind her, the altar now a symbol of something lost, and for a brief moment the ache pressed closer, sharp and personal, but she did not allow it to show, reminding herself that dignity was not something granted by ceremony, but something claimed in moments like this. Near the edge of the hall, a familiar face offered a look of restrained pity. Another averted their gaze entirely, and Elena realized with a strange clarity that public moments had a way of revealing private truths about those who witnessed them. The doors loomed ahead, tall and carved with the marks of history, and as she reached them, a cool night breeze slipped inside, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant trees, a reminder that the world beyond the hall remained vast and indifferent to ritual outcomes. Stepping outside, Elena paused just long enough to steady herself beneath the open sky, the moon hanging low and bright above the courtyard, its light washing over stone and shadow alike, and she felt something inside her loosen, as if the air itself offered permission to breathe again. Behind her, the ceremony resumed in subdued fragments, voices rearranging themselves around what had happened, but she did not turn back, choosing instead to move forward across the courtyard, her footsteps echoing softly as she followed a path she had never expected to take. Unseen by her, from a high balcony where torchlight failed to reach, a figure remained still, his presence blending seamlessly with shadow as his attention stayed fixed on the lone Omega, crossing the open space below, noting not her retreat, but her resolve, the way she did not run yet did not linger, the quiet strength in her departure. He did not move, did not signal, but something in the air shifted all the same, as if the night itself had taken note, and while Elena walked on believing herself alone, destiny had already marked the moment, patient and unhurried, waiting for the hour when observation would become action. Elena Hart did not make it far before the weight of what had happened began to change the way the night looked at her, because news inside a pack moved faster than footsteps, and by the time she reached the outer corridor beyond the courtyard, the whispers had already found her, slipping from shadowed corners and half-lit archways where others lingered with curiosity, thinly veiled as concern. She heard her name spoken softly, then not so softly, heard the familiar phrase failed right repeated as if it were a simple fact rather than a fracture, and she felt the strange sensation of being both present and distant, as though she were walking through a story already being told by someone else. A pair of younger Omegas paused as she passed, their conversation cutting short, one offering a tight, sympathetic smile, while the other looked away entirely, and Elena understood then that pity could bruise just as deeply as cruelty when it stripped choice from the moment. As she moved through the hallways toward the residential wing, the decor shifted from ceremonial grandeur to quieter stone and timber, yet the air felt no lighter, carrying instead the heavy residue of judgment that clung to places where tradition ruled unchecked. An elder attendant stepped aside to let her pass, offering a murmured acknowledgement that felt rehearsed, respectful but distant, as if unsure which version of her deserved recognition now. Elena answered with a nod, maintaining the composure she had carried since the altar, even as something inside her tightened with each measured step. Near the common hearth, a small cluster of pack members had gathered, their voices low but animated, and though she did not pause, fragments reached her ears, speculation about omens, murmured suggestions that the outcome reflected some unseen imbalance, theories shaped more by fear than fact, and Elena felt a brief flare of anger before she smothered it, refusing to let her worth be debated like a misplaced token. She reached her assigned quarters at last, a modest room tucked along the eastern wall, and when the door closed behind her, the quiet pressed in, thick and absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of distant firewood settling in the hearth below. For a moment she stood still, one hand resting against the door, grounding herself in the simple truth of solid wood and steady breath, reminding herself that survival sometimes looked like standing alone without apology. She crossed the room slowly, setting aside the sash from her gown and folding it with care rather than haste, an act of defiance against the chaos of the evening. And as she did, the muffled sounds of the pack drifted through the walls, laughter rising and falling, life continuing as if nothing significant had occurred. The realization stung, yet it also clarified something essential, that ceremonies might mark beginnings and endings, but they did not own the meaning of a life lived beyond them. Elena moved to the small window and looked out across the darkened grounds, the moonlight outlining paths and trees with quiet consistency, and she felt a resolve settle deeper than disappointment, a decision not to vanish simply because expectation had failed her. Somewhere beyond the reach of her senses, the presence that had watched from shadow remained aware of her isolation, not with judgment, but with attention sharpened by interest, recognizing that what unfolded now was not the collapse of an omega, but the testing of her spirit. And as the night carried on, Elena stood at the window believing herself unseen, unaware that every step she took away from humiliation was drawing her closer to a fate that had been waiting patiently all along. By the time dawn hinted at the horizon, Elena Hart had already made her choice, not in a dramatic declaration, but in the quiet way decisions take root, when sleep refuses to come and the mind circles the same truth again and again. She packed lightly, selecting only what she could carry without effort: a worn jacket, sturdy boots, a small canteen, and the simple keepsakes that reminded her who she was beyond ceremony. Moving with deliberate care, so as not to draw attention as she slipped from her quarters and into the cool pre-dawn air. The grounds were hushed, lanterns dimmed to embers, and the familiar paths felt different under her feet, less like home and more like corridors leading outward, and she followed them without looking back, passing through the outer gate as it stood unguarded in the early hour. Beyond the stone markers, the land opened into rolling fields and then into the shadowed edge of the forest, where tall pines stood like silent witnesses, their needles whispering as a light breeze passed through. Elena paused there, steadying her breath, feeling the weight of what she was leaving settle alongside a surprising sense of relief, because flight did not always mean fear, and sometimes it meant choosing oneself when the world had failed to do so. She entered the forest at a measured pace, the ground soft with fallen needles, the air cooler and rich with the scent of earth, and as the trees closed around her, the tension she had carried since the altar began to loosen, replaced by the alert calm that came from relying on her own instincts. Time stretched differently beneath the canopy, marked not by bells or schedules but by the slant of light and the rhythm of her steps, and Elena found herself counting them, grounding herself in movement as she put distance between her past and whatever waited ahead. She followed a narrow trail she remembered from childhood, one that wound gently upward toward higher ground, knowing it would lead her away from known routes and curious eyes, and as she walked, she allowed herself to acknowledge the ache that lingered, the quiet disappointment that had not vanished simply because she chose motion over stillness. Yet even that ache felt different here, less sharp, tempered by the knowledge that she was not being pushed out, but stepping forward on her own terms. Birds stirred as the morning grew brighter, a distant stream murmured somewhere to her left, and Elena drank sparingly from her canteen, conserving both water and resolve, aware that the path ahead would require patience rather than haste. She did not know how far she would go, only that each mile placed her farther from whispers and closer to the truth of who she could become when not measured by tradition. Unseen, beyond the limits of her hearing, a presence moved with equal deliberation, not pursuing in the manner of a chase but aligning its course with hers, attentive to the cadence of her footsteps and the direction of her will. And though Elena sensed nothing more than the forest's quiet companionship, the space around her felt subtly charged, as if the land itself were attentive to her passage. When she reached a small clearing and stopped to rest, sunlight breaking through the branches in pale ribbons, Elena lifted her face to the warmth and allowed herself a single, steady breath of gratitude for the courage to leave, unaware that with every step away from the altar, she was drawing closer to an encounter that would redefine not only her path, but the meaning of being claimed. Elena Hart rested longer than she intended, the forest offering a calm that softened the edges of exhaustion, and when she rose again the sun had climbed higher, filtering through branches in steady bands of light that guided her forward with quiet assurance. She resumed her walk along the faint trail, attentive to the terrain and to her own limits, adjusting her pace to conserve strength, And as the hours passed, she became aware of a subtle order to the land, the way paths curved toward water, the way clearings opened, as if placed with purpose. She did not notice the shift at first, only that the air felt more attentive, as though sound carried farther and silence held more meaning. And it was in that heightened awareness that she sensed she was no longer entirely alone, not with fear, but with the peculiar feeling of being acknowledged. Somewhere beyond her line of sight, moving with the land rather than against it, Alexander Crow observed without haste, his presence measured and restrained, not hidden by effort, but by belonging, and he marked the Omega's progress with a clarity that surprised even him. He noted how Elena paused to listen before crossing uneven ground, how she chose routes that balanced caution with confidence, how she drank sparingly and pressed on without complaint, and these details mattered because they revealed a character shaped by resolve rather than circumstance. From a ridge that overlooked the trail, he watched as she navigated a fallen branch, steadying herself with a hand against bark, then straightened with a small exhale that spoke of patience. And in that moment he understood that what he had seen at the ceremony had not been an exception but a pattern. He remained still, allowing distance to preserve her peace, because watching did not require intrusion, and there was a difference between claiming and possessing that he had learned through years of restraint. As Elena moved into another clearing, she stopped to adjust her pack, glancing around as if testing the quiet, and although she did not see him, Alexander recognized the instinct to check one's surroundings not as fear, but as respect for the unknown. He considered the balance of timing, the importance of allowing choice to remain intact, and chose again to remain unseen, trusting that patience would serve them both. Elena resumed her journey, unaware of the careful alignment occurring beyond her awareness, feeling only that the forest seemed to open rather than resist, that the path ahead held fewer obstacles than expected, and she accepted the small mercy without question. As afternoon light warmed the ground, Alexander shifted his vantage with fluid ease, keeping the same distance, his attention unwavering yet gentle, and he reflected on the silence that had followed the failed rite, on the way Elena had carried herself without spectacle, and on the certainty that some bonds recognized one another long before words were spoken. He did not speak her name aloud, did not announce intent, because observation itself carried weight, and in that quiet guardianship he acknowledged a truth he had not sought, but could not deny. When Elena reached the edge of the clearing and continued onward, her figure framed by light and shadow, Alexander remained where he was for a moment longer, committing the direction of her path to memory, then followed at a respectful distance, resolved not to rush what destiny had already begun, knowing that the moment to step from shadow into certainty would come when choice and timing aligned, and until then, watching would be enough. As the afternoon wore on, Elena's heart became aware of a change that she could not name at first, not a sound or a sight, but a quiet convergence that tightened the air around her like a held breath, and she slowed her steps instinctively, listening to the rhythm of the forest as if it were a language she had always known but rarely needed to speak. The path narrowed, curving toward a stand of older trees whose trunks rose wide and steady, and with each step she felt a growing sense of alignment, as though her direction and the land's intention had quietly agreed. She paused near a shallow stream to refill her canteen, kneeling to let the cool water run clear before filling it, and as she did, she sensed presence not behind her but around her, an awareness that did not intrude, yet did not withdraw, steady and composed. Elena straightened slowly, her gaze lifting to scan the trees without urgency, and she found that her heart remained calm, which surprised her, because the instinct to fear never came, replaced instead by a certainty that whatever shared this space respected boundaries. She took a breath and continued, crossing the stream by stepping stones worn smooth, her footing sure, her posture unguarded, and the forest responded with a gentle hush that felt like acknowledgement. Not far away, Alexander Crow adjusted his pace to mirror hers, keeping the same careful distance he had chosen before, attuned now to the shift he felt within himself, the pull that signaled a moment approaching its proper hour. He observed the way Elena moved with trust rather than haste, how she neither called out nor retreated, and he understood that courage often looked like quiet acceptance rather than challenge. As they moved deeper into the woods, light filtered more sparsely, the air cooling, and Elena wrapped her jacket closer without breaking stride, her thoughts settling into a clarity shaped by motion, and she realized that leaving had not made her smaller, but had widened her sense of possibility. She felt the presence again, closer now yet still unseen, and for the first time she acknowledged it inwardly, not with alarm but with readiness, as if some part of her had been waiting for this convergence long before the altar ever failed her. Alexander noted the moment she paused beneath a broad oak, resting a hand against its bark, and he chose that instant to close the remaining distance by a small measure, enough to share the same clearing without crossing into her line of sight. The air seemed to settle, sounds softening, and he recognized the importance of restraint, the understanding that meeting did not require announcement, only presence grounded in respect. Elena felt the shift as a gentle pressure rather than a threat, a sense of being seen that did not diminish her autonomy, and she turned slightly, not fully around, as if acknowledging a companion without demanding identity. The forest held them both, equal in stillness, and time seemed to stretch, granting space for choice rather than forcing decision. Alexander remained quiet, his stance open, allowing the moment to speak for itself, and in that shared pause, Elena felt a steadiness bloom, the knowledge that whatever came next would be shaped by consent and timing rather than decree. When she took another step forward, testing the silence, the presence moved in harmony, maintaining distance yet affirming alignment, and Elena smiled faintly, not because she understood everything, but because she recognized the truth that some paths met not by pursuit but by parallel movement, and with that realization, the convergence completed itself, readying the ground for a meeting that would honor both shadow and choice. Elena Hart felt the moment before she saw him, a shift in the space ahead that carried intention rather than threat, and when she turned fully this time, the figure stepped into the filtered light with a calm that made the forest seem to settle around him. He did not rush, did not announce himself, but allowed presence to speak first, tall and composed, his posture open, his expression steady, and Elena noted with a quiet clarity that her pulse remained even, her instincts unalarmed. The man inclined his head in a gesture of acknowledgement that felt earned rather than assumed, and when he spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying easily through the clearing without effort, introducing himself as Alexander Crow with a simplicity that belied the authority woven into his bearing. Elena returned the greeting, stating her name without apology, and in the space between them there was no hierarchy imposed, only mutual recognition, as if both understood that this meeting belonged to the present moment rather than any past ceremony. Alexander did not comment on the altar or the failed rite, and that omission mattered, because it left room for Elena to be more than a symbol of disappointment, and she felt the quiet relief of not being asked to explain herself. Instead, he spoke of the forest, of the paths that converged and diverged by choice rather than decree, and Elena listened, aware that his words were an offering rather than a claim, an invitation to understand rather than to submit. She noticed details as they stood there, the way his gaze met hers without pressing, the way his attention remained focused yet unintrusive, and she recognized the same restraint she had sensed while being watched, now clarified into presence without concealment. When he acknowledged that he had observed her journey, he did so without pretense, explaining that he chose to wait until alignment made meeting appropriate, and Elena considered this with a thoughtful pause, appreciating the honesty that did not excuse itself. She asked why, and Alexander answered plainly, stating that he had seen in her a steadiness that endured when expectation fell away, a resilience that did not require witness to exist, and his words carried no flattery, only recognition. Elena felt something settle within her at that, a sense that being seen accurately mattered more than being chosen publicly, and she allowed herself a small nod of acceptance. The forest seemed to lean closer, light shifting as clouds passed overhead, and Alexander took a respectful step back, reinforcing that proximity would be guided by her comfort rather than his intent. He spoke then of paths forward, of the choice to continue alone or to walk with company, emphasizing that any decision would remain hers, and Elena appreciated the absence of urgency, the space given to weigh options without pressure. She studied him for a moment longer, aware that this encounter felt less like an interruption and more like a continuation, as if two lines drawn separately had finally intersected. When she responded, her voice was steady, expressing gratitude for the respect shown and a willingness to share the path for now, without binding promises or demands, and Alexander accepted this with a simple acknowledgement, neither triumph nor expectation crossing his features. As they turned to move together, maintaining a comfortable distance, Elena sensed that something fundamental had shifted, not because she had been claimed, but because she had been met, and in that meeting, the forest seemed to approve, opening the way ahead with quiet assurance as shadow and light fell into balance around them. The path led them to a rise where the trees thinned and the sky widened, late afternoon light stretching long and warm across the clearing, and Elena Hart felt the subtle certainty that this was a place where truths were spoken plainly. Alexander Crow stopped first, turning with deliberate care so that his position never blocked her choice of direction, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority she had come to recognize, grounded not in command but in responsibility. He told her who he was without ornament, that his role carried weight beyond the forest, and that he did not hide it now because concealment would diminish the respect he intended to offer, and Elena listened, absorbing the meaning rather than the title, noting how his words were shaped to inform rather than impress. She felt no shock, only a quiet alignment, as if the shape of the man matched the presence she had sensed long before he stepped into view, and she appreciated that the revelation came here, away from witnesses and ceremony, where truth could stand without spectacle. Alexander continued with care, explaining that what he sought was not possession or performance, but acknowledgement freely given, that any bond worthy of endurance required consent expressed without pressure, and he paused there, allowing silence to hold the space where decision belonged. Elena considered the arc of her journey, the altar that failed her, the courage that carried her into the woods, and the steady respect that met her here, and she recognized that the moment asked not for surrender, but for clarity. She spoke then, naming her need to choose with eyes open and will intact, and Alexander received her words without defensiveness, nodding once to affirm that this condition honored them both. The air felt attentive, the clearing quiet as if the land itself waited, and when Alexander stepped forward by a single measured pace, he did so openly, stating his intent in plain language, that he recognized her as his chosen partner not by decree but by recognition, and that he would stand with her publicly only if she wished it. Elena felt the weight of that choice, not heavy but significant, and she answered with equal plainness, acknowledging the bond she felt forming not as an obligation but as alignment, a decision made in daylight rather than shadow. Alexander inclined his head, accepting her words as sufficient, and in that instant, the claim took form not as a mark or command, but as a shared understanding spoken aloud, witnessed by the quiet forest and the steady sky. He stated his commitment clearly, promising protection that did not confine and partnership that did not erase her autonomy, and Elena felt a warmth of certainty rather than a rush, the comfort of being met rather than seized. They stood there together for a moment longer, the world unchanged yet subtly reordered, and Elena realized that the power of the claim lay in its restraint, in the space it preserved for her voice and her pace. When they turned to continue along the ridge, it was side by side with room between them, a visible sign of consent honored, and as the light shifted toward evening, Elena understood that what had begun as flight had become affirmation, not because someone chose her loudly, but because she chose herself, and was answered with respect. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt earned rather than granted, the sky pale and wide as Elena Hart and Alexander Crow descended from the ridge along a path that led toward open ground, their pace unhurried, their alignment quiet and unmistakable. The forest thinned and the land opened into a broad meadow where the air carried the promise of day, and Elena noticed how the weight she once carried had shifted into something steadier, a sense of belonging to her own choices rather than to the judgment of others. Alexander paused at the edge of the clearing, offering her space to decide how the next step would be taken, and Elena felt a calm certainty settle as she chose to continue forward, not behind him and not ahead, but alongside, their movement a visible statement of mutual regard. As they approached the stone markers that signaled the boundary of pack lands, figures began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn not by command, but by the unmistakable presence of leadership tempered with restraint, and Elena sensed curiosity rather than scrutiny in their attention. Alexander did not raise his voice or posture, yet his presence carried recognition, and when he acknowledged the gathering with a simple nod, the murmurs quieted without instruction. Elena stood with her shoulders relaxed and her gaze steady, aware that she was being seen again, but this time without the narrow lens of ceremony, and she realized that dignity was not reclaimed through spectacle, but affirmed through consistency. Alexander spoke briefly, stating his intent with clarity that required no embellishment, affirming a partnership chosen openly and respectfully, and the words settled across the meadow with a quiet finality that invited acceptance rather than demand. Elena felt no need to add to them, her choice already evident in her stance and her calm, and the gathering responded with a collective understanding that recognition had been given where it mattered most. As the sun climbed higher, light warmed the stones and grass alike, and Elena noticed how the space around her felt neither constrained nor elevated beyond reach, simply balanced, as if the land acknowledged an order shaped by consent. When the gathering dispersed, it did so without urgency, leaving behind a sense of completion rather than conclusion, and Elena found herself smiling softly, not from relief alone, but from the recognition that her path had widened rather than narrowed. Alexander turned to her then, his expression composed yet open, and asked how she wished to proceed, and Elena answered without hesitation, choosing a future defined by shared direction and maintained independence. Together they walked onward, the meadow giving way to familiar routes that felt newly aligned, and Elena understood that what began as abandonment had transformed into affirmation not through reversal but through growth. The day unfolded with quiet purpose, each step reinforcing the truth that strength could be gentle and choice could be honored, and as Elena looked ahead, she carried with her the knowledge that being claimed did not diminish her autonomy, but rather reflected it, a partnership rooted in respect, witnessed by light, and sustained by the simple courage to walk forward together.